Everybody, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're going to have a discussion regarding Nintendo's community tournament guidelines. We're going to review everything, have a great discussion on it. I am joined by the one, the only Bobbeigh.
Hello.
Bobbeigh was kind enough to be able to join us. Mr. Shasta is not able to join us for today, but self-help and care is primary number one. So as a friendly reminder to everybody who is donating their time and you're participating in AGDQ, please make sure you hydrate, you sleep, you take care of yourself, you eat, do everything you need to do. That is far more important in your personal well-being than anything else. So we wish Mr. Shasta a very, very well-deserved nap for all the hard work that Shasta's put in behind the scenes. So what we're going to cover today is, pending that everything's going to work, there we go. All right, our agenda is going to cover what exactly are community tournament guidelines. Okay, have an explanation of what they are and what they mean. We'll go over in detail Nintendo's October 24th, 2023 community tournament guidelines, and then we're going to compare them to other community tournament guidelines. Sometimes they're worded a little bit different in terms of the title. So, for example, Electronic Arts has community tournament guidelines, but Epic through Fortnite has event license, and Capcom has their community license. So they're slightly different in terms of their title, but it's essentially the same thing. It is the community tournament guidelines or the use agreement that you're essentially agreeing to when you go to utilize their product. We'll have a summary throughout each major point. We'll call it, I guess, our own checkpoints like we have here at AGDQ this year. And we'll have a further panel discussion that will then open up to an audience Q&A. So, with that out of the way, what are community tournament guidelines? The TLDR is community tournament guidelines, or CTGs, help an intellectual property holder, IP, to protect their assets by having control over how their IP is utilized. It is essentially a terms of use agreement, and these are the rules that you need to follow to be able to utilize their intellectual property in certain specified uses. So if you want to hold a tournament and you want to be able to do that, well, you need to follow these particular rules if you're going to be allowed to do so. And this allows the IP holder to control how their IP is represented by third parties, and mostly, in my opinion, attempts to limit any potential damage that that holder might sustain by a third party. I'll go into it a little bit more in detail, but the last thing you want as Nintendo is to have some person put together a Smash tournament and then explicit things are said, it's sponsored by alcohol, you really just got a really toxic environment, and they happen to say that they're sponsored by Nintendo. And that now reflects exactly on Nintendo.
Yeah, one of the things is especially for a brand and entity as family friendly as Nintendo, these guidelines would represent them the sponsors would not be reflective of their vision of wholesome family gaming.
Yep.
If it's through this gambling or crypto or anything very, very mature.
Yeah.
So good.
You mean no? You mean Nintendo doesn't want me to invest in Dogecoin? I mean, I would say I think that's probably not guidance.
I think they'll keep to the Wario Land coins for now. So
let's go over Nintendo community guidelines as not really a whole. I'm not going to cover every single thing, I promise. We'll make it in bite-sized pieces so we can kind of discuss them. But the first thing that pops up on the community tournament guidelines is that community tournaments may be operated by individuals. I want you to take particular focus on the word individuals. There is obviously parentheses and it says organizers afterwards, but it is for individuals participating in tournaments and for individuals viewing tournaments, provided that these guidelines are followed. So what does that mean in a nutshell? Companies can't or are not subject to this. You need to go and apply for a license with Nintendo. At least in my reading of it, is that this is if Bobbeigh individually, as a person, wants to start a community tournament. It's Joe if I want to start a community tournament. It's not GDQ if they want to do a community tournament. They would have to outright, can't follow these guidelines because it's not applicable. They are then immediately required to go through Nintendo to apply for a license. And that's essentially the key thing to keep in mind here, is that what we're going to cover is purely directed towards individuals. They note here that community tournaments may not generate commercial revenue except as provided through the guidelines. So key language in there is that it may not generate commercial revenue except, so the real key term there is except. So if you as a organizer are able to somehow pocket a little bit of money through the transaction, of which some allow you to do so, they actually have explicitly laid out dollar amounts that you can make within one particular year, but Nintendo is leaving that open without giving an exact dollar amount, it seems. But they're saying, as long as you follow these rules, it's okay if you pocket a little bit of money, but they try to be, especially with the wording of it, they try to make it seem like we don't want you to make money. But if you do, as long as you're following these rules, we're not going to be horrified. Next is that tournaments may include up to 200 participants for in-person tournaments, or up to 300 participants for online tournaments. So they do set player caps, and we'll review how Nintendo compares with other major companies, and we'll see whether they have participant caps, or whether they allow for particular restrictions on income. But that's one thing of note that I took from Nintendo's community tournament guidelines to say, we want to limit the amount of people who are participating, and I think that that's purposeful. They really want to try to make sure that the amount of people that are there is not so vast that it were to counter or have a potential market eating of licensed tournaments. They want to try to ensure that if you're doing a local or community tournament, that it's not going to eat into or become greater than, let's say, a regional that might get a license that Nintendo gives their blessing to.
Yeah, and like, not only do you have to worry about stuff through licensing, but there's also Nintendo's actual esports initiative. You've seen it for a lot of competitive, like Smash Brothers and Splatoon, and where they have like that certain set of prize, that's pretty extravagant and exclusive for Nintendo sanctioned with their own, making their own event.
Yep.
So if you're going to be trying to provide either a prize pool or prizes like that are worth thousands and thousands of dollars, that's kind of like out of Nintendo's admissions for what they want for their model tournament, there's going to be a bit of a problem.
Absolutely. The last thing you want to do is to give a prize that's possibly greater than Nintendo's own, vision of what they want to give to their participants. And speaking of that, that's a great segue into the next segment of the community tournament guidelines, which is that they note here that organizers have reached the legal age of, or that have reached the legal age of majority within your jurisdiction, which as a general point for purposes of discussion, let's just call it 18. Okay, but within the jurisdiction, as long as you are of the age of majority, meaning you are of legal age, it's another way to word it that we might remember it as, that you may collect entry fees from participants, the people who play in the tournament, so long as it does not exceed $20 per person. And we'll cover it, but some companies mimic that, or Nintendo is, I guess, mimicking those same policies, and some are just silent on it. In fact, they even leave it somewhat silent for viewers and spectators. But what it says here is that entry fees collected from participants may be used for covering the cost of organizing the tournament and be used towards prizing. Organizers that have reached the legal age of majority in their jurisdiction, again, once they become an adult per se, may provide goods and services to participants as prizes. And the key thing, which is the segue of what you were just talking about, Bobby, is that no prize may exceed a market value of $5,000 in total or include the prohibited items outlined in question 17. We're not going to cover question 17, but the short version of it is no alcohol, no drugs, no nothing that otherwise would be deemed an inappropriate gift that you should be giving to any participant. It's again about that brand and image and making sure that it's focused on appropriate value and category of items. So I think you're spot on when you note that it really does put a limit on the cap of what those prizes can be, because you can't have, excuse the reference, but the AFC or the NFC, championship game outweigh the Super Bowl. It's going to be that the major headliner is going to be the elephant in the room, or the biggest thing that you want to see, not the regional tournament. And then the other thing to note is that the total value of cash prizes in a single organizer, what they can offer through a community tournament within a 12-month period, must be no more than the equivalent of $10,000. So the way that we look at it is that no prize may exceed a market value of $5,000 in total, but you're limited to $10,000 in compensation that you can give to participants within a 12-month period. And I think that that's purposefully done in order to force you to be limited in the scope of how many times you can hold these events, and thus garner, your own, I guess, whereabouts. And Stubb, do you have a question?
I didn't notice the $10,000 thing specifically says cash.
So it does note there that the total value of cash prizing, but I would argue and say as far that would extend into prizes. It's a good note. But if I had to take a stab at it, Nintendo would absolutely try to limit that to say that the value of what you are able to give is probably going to be $10,000, and they're going to keep an eye on that. If you're able to kind of sneak a couple of games here or there, I don't think they might crack down on it. But if we're getting to a point where you're giving a lot of Nintendo Switches out, they're going to keep an eye on that. I think they're going to try to say you're pushing it, because you'll see other competing companies have an actual limit on the amount of tournaments that you can hold within a particular time period. And I think that that's kind of where they're coming from, is they're trying to stop you from being able to do too much to take attention away from the big stage. I don't know if you have any opinions on that, Bobby.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's pretty thankful for these guidelines that a lot of major events and worldwide, extravagant major events for the many Nintendo-centric games or even fighting games, which you can dive into a little bit. But what was that? The sort of entities, these sort of brands and organizers, don't really want to step on each other's toes too much. So of course, they don't want to be hosting these major events every often. The major kind of downer is even if you had that one event throughout the year, you still could not have, you still couldn't go entirely all out.
Yeah.
So them kind of being a little bit more restricting in that matter to not take away from Nintendo's very seldom events as well.
Yeah.
Would be pretty good to protect the sort of model event that Nintendo wants.
Absolutely. So the next thing that they note here is that for in-person community tournaments, organizers that are of legal age within their jurisdiction can also collect an admission fee from spectators of no more than $15 per person. Okay? And I think I noted it before, but some companies don't give any guidance on it. Some of them give guidance on it. But these admission fees, if you're holding a Nintendo IP-related tournament, you need to be able to do the following. Is that the fees collected from the spectators must be used solely for the purpose of covering the cost of organizing the tournament, and they cannot be utilized towards prizing. Slightly different. If you're a participant, it can be used towards prizing. Think of it as a pay-to-play and it's shared between all of the participants to get the prize. Spectators, no. You're purely focused on taking that income or those monies. Let's not use the word income. They don't want to hear that. But you're purely taking the monies that are coming in for the event and only utilizing it towards the operation of the tournament. And then it states here that collecting fees from spectators for online community tournaments is not permitted under any circumstances. So this only applies to in-person tournaments only, essentially. if you could have an in-person tournament, but you also can't collect online viewership fees for said in-person tournament. So think of it like this, it is only for butts and seats. That's a good way to kind of remind ourselves. It's only if there's a butt and a seat you can collect a fee for it. If you're watching at home, you shouldn't have to pay for it, and that would be a direct violation of the guidelines. And I think that that's reflected basically everywhere. That's a standard. It also states that organizers collecting fees must publicly disclose all accounting related to the cost of hosting the event properly, including entry fees, admission fees, the prizes that were distributed by posting them on a website or in a social media accessible to everyone. Now, let's give an example without trying to state names and anything, but I'll try to make it fairly obvious for you. Let's say that there is an event that gathers 2 times a year, and said event has to or likes to hold tournaments for its participants in order to enjoy, because we're all gamers and we like to be able to enjoy games. Well, if you as a company, with the very first thing we covered, they can't follow these guidelines because said company would need to apply for a license because they're not an individual. So then you could say, well, we then leave it to individuals in order to organize said tournaments, maybe using a website like Challenge, right? And you could utilize a website like that in order to put together a tournament. But now the question is that for an event like that charges a fee in order to attend, can you make an argument that that fee is part of your entrance fee for said tournament? Even if you would have to make an argument to say maybe it would be open to the general public. If said tournament was open to the general public, you could then say, okay, well, then it's not a part of a collection of a fee, then maybe perhaps said individual who puts it together on behalf of the organization of their own equipment. Again, let me retract that, strike that. It's not on behalf of the organization, right? The people who are attending the event want this event, and we look now to an individual to act individually without any form of consent from the organization, okay? That's the way that we would look at it from a legal standpoint. But the key part is that if Bobbeigh were to say, as an individual, I'm going to put together a Smash tournament, and it's just me. It is not under the, the blessing of said event, okay? And I'm doing it on my own. Even then, you still have a warrior concern of, if you have to pay just to get into the event space to then participate in the tournament, is that not a fee to participate? And if you are collecting fees, then are you not obligated in order to disclose all of the accounting relating to the hosting of the event, entry fees, admission fees, and prizes? And I think that this in particular is going to give pause for a lot of organizations to not hold tournaments. And I think that this might be the main reason why, at least in my opinion, said Nintendo IP is not currently present in one particular event. And again, we're not talking names here, but I think that this is probably the key thing in my opinion as to why I think we don't currently have that in certain events that are, either ongoing or coming in the future. So, what's your take on it, Bobbeigh, in terms of the whole collection of fees and the public accounting? Do you think that that's a good thing, that we force these organizers to be public in terms of where these fees are going?
I'd say it's very transparent bookkeeping, just kind of watered down to, all your legalese and all that. When I had my time in organizing these, tournaments as, as an individual, on my own, you don't really want any questions about where money is going. Especially if you're holding them, again, within that 12-month period, and also if questions are asked from audience about where your prize is coming from, how is one person doing all of this? And it should be on the person, the organizer, to be as upfront and transparent as possible, especially if they're running not only say a Nintendo game, but multiple games within that entire event to begin with.
Yeah.
So, like we said earlier, we'll go into it a little bit later about these different entities, these different publishers having different community guidelines for how they want their events to be run. this is just basically like, their way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think, and I'll preface this by purely just saying that Bobbeigh is talking obviously from your own standpoint of your own experience. I'm the one that's kind of going on the limb to give, assumptions or opinions. They're not Bobbeigh's opinions at all regarding why certain organizations are not conducting these tournaments. I guess for jokingly, the heat can fall on me for said, hypothetical that we're talking about.
Well, the thing also is that like I'm not a very wise mind to begin with. Like I know the ins and outs of organizing and not trying to step on anyone else's toes. But again, the situation could be different for anyone trying to be like an individual trying to run.
Yeah.
Again, like you said, I wasn't contracted or anything under anyone to organize these events.
Yes.
So again, you just kind of got to know your stuff when treading these different platforms.
Absolutely, and I think it harks back in the whole me doing the circle and the dance leads to the following statement, which is I think you nail it by saying that it's about trust. It's about transparency. And not that these organizations are lacking in that, it's that it's a level of detail that they either are not prepared to do in such a short period of time, and that it's something that they've never had to have done before. But if you were to include this content, you now would be required to share this information, and quite frankly, especially if it's a company, they might not want to share that information. If it's a nonprofit, they're most likely sharing that information to begin with. But if you're a company that's for profit and you're doing this type of stuff, you're probably not wanting to give the ins and outs of how the sausage is made. So I guess the kind of key thing to wrap up with this particular section is that they also note here that when you're hosting a community tournament, organizers may not receive goods, services, or money from third parties as sponsors. That's just right off the bat letting you know. No sponsors. Nintendo is, and we'll go over it a little bit more in depth, but Nintendo's made it very clear they don't want you getting any sponsors, anybody. You're on your own, you're doing this, you are not allowed to get anything from any sponsors because Nintendo essentially does not want to be in cahoots with anybody. They have their own brand, they're the biggest IP, in the world, especially from a video game standpoint, and arguably, and that they want to make sure that there is no stone left unturned, that there's no question about that. Next is that they note here, only with prior consent from participants can organizers monetize posting of videos, still images, etc. related to the community tournament on personal accounts in line with the Nintendo game content guidelines for online video and information sharing platforms. The key reason why we have this here is that it says, the total amount of revenue a single organizer earns in a 12-month period through these activities should be no more than the equivalent of $10,000. Meaning that we go all the way back to the beginning of the presentation when we said you can make, it's non-profit, or you cannot make revenue from this except for, and then everything that we've discussed, and you are limited to $10,000 within a 12-month period. I might mess up and say a calendar year, but let's just call it a 12-month period. You are limited, and they're purposefully doing that again to ensure that they're keeping these events small, they're not becoming commercialized, they're not challenging Nintendo, and they're really trying to ensure that people aren't going to try to take advantage of the amateur, e-gaming scene and try to find it as a business opportunity using Nintendo's IP.
Yeah, and this kind of falls in line with the whole bookkeeping point for this publicly disclosing where all this money would come from. So yeah.
It's all, so far, it's been fair, at least in my opinion, everything that Nintendo's kind of put so far. I don't find it horrible, but I mean, we'll go a little bit more once we start getting into some competitors. Maybe I'll feel a little bit different, but at least reading it, I'm not horrified by what we have here. So anytime there is bold text, that's normally, hey, pay attention. So legal speak is bold is important, okay? So they note here that the community tournament is not affiliated with Nintendo and makes no use of Nintendo trademarks or IP except as permitted by these guidelines, okay? Nintendo went out of their way to bold this for a reason. They want you to understand and know that it is your obligation as a community tournament holder, an organizer, an individual, that you are to let everybody know that Nintendo has nothing to do with this whatsoever, and that is purposeful. They note here that the organizer must do the following on site or on any websites or any other promotional period or materials. And the key thing that I want to take focus on is the very first bullet under that, which is, quote, Nintendo is not a sponsor or affiliated with this tournament. And that is extremely important language because they want to make it very clear that they are not giving their blessing, if you will, on this. You're using their IP, but they haven't gone and said, this is the one for you to go and attend or to watch. Okay? They want to make sure that you know that Nintendo is not affiliated. And I would say that that's actually a standard, believe it or not. I'm making it seem like it's this really big thing, but again, bold is important. They want to put attention to this, but I think it's a standard within most of the industry. Next is the games used must have been officially launched or service has officially begun in the region where the community tournament is taking place. This one I thought was super interesting, and I think that we can have at least a small little sidebar on this one, which is that you cannot use pirated versions of the game. It needs to be a officially purchased version of a Nintendo IP, and moreover, it cannot be modified. You could make an argument that randomizers or even just graphical mods to a game, you could make an argument that would be deemed a modified version of a Nintendo game, and thus you are not allowed to be able to utilize it.
Yeah, they actually kind of make an additional point of that with their content creation guidelines that was updated a little bit earlier last year, and that's probably the most knee-jerk reaction that response of a lot of content creators, a lot of gamers, a lot of tournament goers, because especially for Nintendo's competitive brands. You would even if you were to go to one of those events, they still would be partaking in the pirated software or mods or anything like that. It's a really big part of the community, and it's a really big part of how to preserve the integrity of a game.
Yeah.
Or even to tweak it as people see fit for easier accessibility, for example. There seems to be a kind of a pushback, a tug of war, because like I said, so far these guidelines are kind of pretty cut and dry. Like some of it's okay, Nintendo, but it was a pretty good rule of thumb for kind of protecting what they want to do. But it's this right here that would probably receive the biggest pushback, because doing a small scale tournaments or events or anything like that, I don't think anyone's gonna care.
I genuinely agree with you.
But if crypto gambling sponsored LLC tournament brings the community back with Project Redacted, that can be taking away a lot from what Nintendo wants. Of course, Nintendo could have the potential to do this, and that argument can be made for another hand.
Yeah.
But it's not their vision.
Agreed. I think the key thing that really gets me, and let's get it out of the way, right? The elephant in the room for it is that the pirated part I completely understand. I know you completely understand that too. Is that to some extent it'd be difficult if you wanted to do a Secret of Evermore, tournament for whatever reason, or insert hard to find game that you would have to have an actual physical copy of, and in order to make it happen. I get or I understand that you'd want to prevent that, and maybe perhaps that's an excuse for pirated versions of it. Side note, not condoning that at all. Don't pirate your games, get them appropriately. But with that out of the way, what's the argument if you're utilizing something like a randomizer? I mean, let's just be honest. Most people that are on Twitch or online content creators, they're not using a cartridge when they're doing a Fireway randomizer or an Emerald, randomizer.
At the very least, not a officially manufactured and stands by this official seal of NOA. But yeah.
Yeah. Or take my apologies if I'm incorrectly pronouncing it, but Archipelago.
Yeah. Right. Those sorts of mods.
What about that? Does that not fall under here now, to where if you have a community tournament that involves a Nintendo IP that falls within an archipelago, you know, what are we looking at? Are we now in this, you know, obviously, legal stuff, gray area, that's everything that we live in, right? But the key part, though, is that mods and things like archipelagos are technically banned in terms of, you know, in terms of the community tournament guidelines.
Yeah, and there have been a lot of events, like not just this, but like we've seen, you know, tournaments on like Speed King, for example, to a wide audience, and it's an online event. I don't think any have been like, you know, tournaments where, you know, money was thrown in, but it's still a pretty nice chunk of like a retro audience with guys on that event, and maybe not like anywhere else, you know, official events.
Yeah. So I think the final thing to know, which is not, you know, it's not a horrible thing, but it's we were actually just joking about it outside of the panel room, not as when we were in the hotel lobby, is that it does note here, games with online play must use the online gameplay services and or servers officially provided by Nintendo. There may or may not be another tournament from another, you know, provider or another IP holder that's currently scheduled in a potential, you know, event, not giving names again, and that might be on the chopping block now, because other said company has recently or within reason released a similar requirement that it needs to play through official servers of that company. So, you know, that might also force said company to make a decision to say, we don't know, I don't think there's a final answer on it, but that's at least what was going through the grapevine. But also reasonable for them to say, we don't want you doing something locally, we want you to go through our servers and utilize what we have. So it does note here, separate or onto another part of the community tournament guidelines. In addition, Nintendo games may not be used for the community tournaments that, and this is their catch-all paragraph, I would say, at the end, right? They want to make sure that essentially they end with this and kind of just say, this is what we couldn't fit in here with some reasonable, you know, backing up, and we're just going to throw it in. And that is that any situation of are illegal or inappropriately conducted or could be viewed as offensive or otherwise inappropriate is further described in question 16 below, meaning that you cannot use the games in any form of tournament that might be deemed offensive, period. That's essentially what question 16's answer is going to be, is that it cannot be anything that's deemed as, you know, hate speech or anything that will cause some form of, you know, of bad look for Nintendo. Your tournament needs to follow certain particular guidelines. It needs to be well held. Failure to protect any health or safety or dignity of participants or spectators, have sponsors or that advertise or promote any entity, products, or services. You can't have any of that. They've already technically said that part, but they want to say it again just to be sure. They want to promote any, want to make sure that there's no promoting of any campaigns or initiatives based on personal organized opinions, ideologies, or beliefs, or political beliefs. They also want to ensure that there's no inclusion of anything that damages the value of Nintendo's brand and intellectual property. And then they also have here, fail to follow the guidelines, and then what I think is the funniest part is the very last one, which is as vague as it possibly can be. Anything that involves what Nintendo deems inappropriate. There is no guidance on it whatsoever. It is completely up to Nintendo's opinion to be able to say, I didn't like that, I deem that inappropriate, and therefore you are not allowed to utilize our IP purely just because we don't like this one thing. And it's so vague that it's very difficult to be able to get around that. Go for it, yeah.
So, getting rid of that last bullet point, because I had this question before then, but like in other contracts that you've seen, who determines what is offensive? Like when it says the views, you know, do not have anything that could be viewed as offensive. Offensive to whom?
Yeah.
And I understand the last bullet point answers that question, but normally when you would see that, like, I'll give an example. If somebody says, you know, trans rights, well, a lot of people in this area where we are right now physically don't deem that's offensive, but other people do. So who, when they say you can't do anything that could be viewed as offensive, who determines what is offensive?
Yeah.
If they didn't have that last bullet point.
And then, Bobby, I think I'll field that, and then if you want to give any additional, you know, opinions on it, is who gets to decide that is Nintendo in this case, whether if we like that or not. Until litigation is enacted to challenge it, and then it would ultimately be a jury that would make a decision on that. My opinion is that it really is Nintendo that makes the final decision. And I don't know Nintendo's internal workings as to how they make a decision on that. I'm assuming that they would, have some form of system that would flag something. You could send it into Nintendo, and then they would forward that over to their legal department, and then they would have a very spirited discussion about what type of damage could be derived from, said issue or said part that may be inappropriate. And then from there, they would make a decision to rule down and say, we deem this as inappropriate, consider this a cease and desist. You're no longer allowed to be able to, hold tournaments for this particular, for our IP, our brand, okay? That's going to be completely up to Nintendo. Is that right, in my opinion? No. I think that it gives way too much power to Nintendo, but the reality is the following. It's their game, their IP, you're essentially agreeing to utilize the game within certain parameters that they have the right to technically say no to, but they're granting you permission to utilize it, and if you want to be able to play by the rules, you have to play by their rules until it's challenged otherwise. Very quickly make a joke of it. But it's like when you go to buy a home, and you get a mortgage. You can't really go to the bank and be like, I don't like this term. Can we change this one term about foreclosure? Can we get rid of this whole thing where if I don't pay you, you can't actually put the mortgage through foreclosure? They can't. The bank's going to look at you and go, it's our game. We make the rules. You can either play by the rules or you can go somewhere else. And essentially, that's kind of the mentality you have to have with how Nintendo's handling this, which is that it's a catch-all. Do I really think that Nintendo is going to stop on smaller tournaments because someone or a tournament decided to say trans rights or something like that? And I know that that's not a worry I think that we have. Hopefully it's not a worry that I think that we have. But will they do that? Absolutely not. I think it's going to be for more really hard-line things that we would be kind of scratching our heads over and going, oh, no, that was not good. Like, that's not good. And then having that type of scenario is where Nintendo could draw the line. That's at least my opinion. I don't know if you feel any different.
No, I think you put it pretty succinctly. And even if you were to have a final say, I highly doubt Nintendo would have that amount of transparency with a public-facing audience about hey, this is what we did, and this is how we shut this down, and this is why we did it. This is definitely a pretty big blanket term and blanket phrase for sticking to the community tournament guidelines, but they have the power to just stop to stop any of that effort full stop.
Yeah.
So whatever they can do to protect and also just nip things in the bud to absolutely be good ones so that no litigation at all. I think it's pretty acceptable. We have to work around Nintendo's guidelines for a lot of other things that we don't agree with to begin with. It's another game that we got to play with.
Great. So don't hate me for this thought. I'm going to go off script very, very slightly, which is, how are we still looking with your schedule right now? Are we still looking all right? For those who don't know, by the time you're going to watch this VOD, it's already going to be over by then, but Bobbeigh's going to run tonight Bloodstained.
Yeah, Bloodstained Virtual tonight.
And you're going to kill it. You're going to do awesome.
Thank you. Before that, we have a bit of an interview after Starfield. I think I had about 20 lines.
So how about we do this then? We'll give it about 10. We'll try to see how far we can get through, and then you'll be stuck with me after that. But super appreciative of Bobbeigh being able to hang out with us. You're very busy, and I really appreciate the time that you're giving us. Like I said, it's only going to happen by the time you're watching this, but Bobbeigh's going to kill it for Bloodstained. So definitely go watch the VOD. I'd say go watch it live, but by this point again, you're going to be able to watch the video on demand afterwards. So we'll keep things moving. TLDR about everything that we just talked about with the Nintendo community guidelines. Okay, you must be an individual, not a legal entity. You can only have a max of 200 participants for an in-person tournament and a max of 300 participants for an online tournament. Organizers may collect a fee from participants, but it can be no greater than $20 per person. Organizers may collect a fee from in-person spectators, not online spectators, and those in-person spectator fees cannot be greater than $15 per person. No single prize can be greater than $5,000 in value. And I'm going out on a limb on this because I know it was brought up as a good question from Stump earlier, but it does note there that total cash prizes offered within a 12-month period cannot be greater than $10,000. However, I would actually go as far as to say that I think Nintendo would try to crack down on it if you were giving a fair amount of value in terms of prizes as well, because they really want to try to stop people from finding a loophole and do what I think the ultimate purpose is, which is prevent these smaller community tournaments from gaining traction commercially and then become bigger or to rival or challenge licenses or tournaments that Nintendo plans to make money from. All right, also in, I guess, closing from the Nintendo Community Tournament Guidelines is, if you are collecting fees, you must disclose, quote, all accounting related to the cost of hosting of the event promptly, including any fees, admission fees, and prizes attributed by posting them on a website and or social media accessible to everyone. And I think that that's going to give a lot of pause to a lot of organizations and people who are going to put it up, because although Bobbeigh's spot on and noting and saying that, especially when you were doing tournaments, honesty and being transparent is paramount, because the community trusts you, and thus you need to make sure that you continue to get that trust from them. However, an LLC might not want to share the inner workings of an entire event if, for whatever reason, that you are inadvertently paying the fee to otherwise access a tournament. So maybe perhaps you might not see that at your local event that you might go to. It also stated that you were also able to receive good services, money, etc. from third-party sponsors, which is Nintendo saying no sponsors at all with the community tournaments. You must also publicly disclose that Nintendo is not a sponsor of or is affiliated with the tournament, which is kind of standard again. We'll go over that. It also says that no pirated or modified versions of the Nintendo games are allowed, which I think, per our discussion, that's the key takeaway I think from me. That's really different from other other companies and really kind of hampers down, because I think Nintendo has a big modded community, in my opinion, and that really really puts a wet blanket on everything. And then also they note here the last part, which we talked about as well, which is you cannot involve anything that Nintendo deems inappropriate, that catch-all. So I think what we'll do, Bobbeigh, is we'll kind of just leave it open to some final thoughts from you. If you have any questions in the audience that might be directed for Bobbeigh to answer in Bobbeigh's experience, we can do that. And then, by all means, go kill it in the interview, and then get ready to go kick butt in the stand. So, with that being said, I think I'll open it up to a question that we have over here.
So, Bobbeigh, what would you have to change? Like, what have you done in previously in tournaments that you can't do anymore with these guidelines? What would you have to change? Is there anything you would have to change to comply?
To comply? So, I'm of the camp that, for the smaller community tournaments, like the rooms filled with maybe about 30 or 40 people, is that, you probably more than likely will never, cross the threshold of these guidelines. If you're just doing, just random tournaments in your garage that's not being broadcasted, Nintendo's not even going to have an eye on it. These are just basically how I see it as an organizer and also as an attendee, where it's just one, I'm not making big bang from it. They're not they close down all of those avenues. Two, the sponsors and prizes, even if they are extravagant, they still might not align with Nintendo's vision for a community tournament. I'm probably not going to be able to reach out to any of those sponsors and all that. So, but when running pretty much something high scale for a regional or a major, that's where Nintendo will probably appear the most eyes on. This is where you'll see actually, I don't even know if they have a list of sanctioned sponsors, no sponsors. Exactly.
No sponsors. Yeah.
So you're not going to be seeing bottles with labels on them or anything, and that's fine because you're as a competitor, you're only there to pretty much play, and all the other stuff within the event, they have a whole different other sheet for. So for something like me, I don't think I would change much of anything. We can talk about this whole no mods, no pirating games and all that stuff. That's a whole other can of worms. But for something small scale, I do not think that much would be affected in that.
I think just to reiterate on that, I don't think this affects small-scale community tournaments really at all.
Yeah.
Chances are they're not getting sponsors to begin with, right? If it's in your garage, or if it's at your school, or if it's, here or there, you're more likely to be sponsored by Girl Scout cookies. And I say it jokingly, of course, nothing wrong with that, but you're more likely to have, pizza brought in, for something like that. And that's not really going to trigger, a sponsorship, if you will, right? The key is just going to be is that this really is only going to affect individuals who are trying to market or make some form of commercial revenue off of regular tournaments by being a networking and organizer for individuals in the community within the competitive or amateur, esports scene.
And thankfully, like the type of tournaments and events that feature Nintendo games probably wouldn't even constitute like very big cash prizes for like the individual running it.
Yeah.
Like the prevalent Nintendo stuff that we see are a lot of retro, a lot of old school, they're the old school brawlers and all that stuff. And I mean, I think as we've seen in the last couple of years, where our esports bubble and esports team bubble, esports comedy is kind of bursting. I don't think anyone really wants to touch that.
Yeah. Agreed. I really, bringing it home for this, it really is that it's going to be the modded section of this that's going to really change things, because you can't utilize the pirated stuff, and I'm going to be honest with you, I think most of these tournaments are utilizing some form of a pirated, stuff. They might have in-person, someone brings a Nintendo 64 and you play Smash on the N64, and that's great, but what if it's an online tournament? Most people who are going to be participating, it's probably going to be through some form of, a ROM that's been obtained. So that's the key thing that I think is going to be the lasting part of this, and that will affect smaller communities, right? And then the other part of that is just no sponsors at all. Again, do I think that smaller communities are going to be obtaining some form of sponsorship? They might, but the chances are on the lower end. But it does cut that off completely.
Yeah.
So it does prevent you from doing that. Those are the two things that I think affect smaller community tournament organizers. Those are the two lasting things of the Nintendo guidelines, in my opinion.
And honestly, I think that sometime this year there will be some form of crackdown on it, because, like I said about the other content creation guidelines, it might not be bold font all the time, but you've seen it in two separate rule sets.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's something that they will reiterate and make explicitly clear if it treads on taking anything away from them.
I think we have time for maybe one more question if anyone has anything for Bobby. Otherwise, we can let Bobby go kick butt in Bloodstained tonight.
I'll try and make this quick. Do you think these guidelines could be interpreted as applying to things that aren't well understood to be tournaments, like charity events, races, long-running leaderboards?
I'll tackle it first, and then I'll let you kind of wrap it up, and I'll be pretty quick with it. Is that it really is going to focus on the initial language of what's going to qualify as a tournament, right? If you are, even if it's just for a charity, or if you're doing something maybe at your high school, or if you're doing something that is for charity based, you're looking at, one, you have to be an individual, not a company, right? First of all, that's requirement number one. Okay. Second is that, are you collecting any form of fee from anybody, either a participant or a spectator? If you are, I think that regardless of what you're doing, you're now falling under the guidelines. It could be a racing game, it could be Diddy Kong Racing, or sorry, that might not be good. We'll go Mario Kart. There we go. I don't know why I went Diddy Kong Racing. That was a horrible example, but it could be Mario Kart. You could go for Smash, right? Any of these, insert game here, as long as it's a Nintendo IP, you're now in their turf. And if you're collecting a fee, Nintendo wants to make sure that there's some form of a watchful eye on it to ensure compliance, and you would have to be able to obtain a license if you are doing it under the banner of an organization. So if you're a charity, this doesn't apply to you. You have to go and apply for a license immediately. If you're a school, right, or if you're some form of body that's not an individual, you have to apply for a license. But if you as an individual are looking to put together this tournament and you're collecting any form of fee or getting any form of prizes out, Nintendo wants to ensure that they're on top of that. And that would ultimately be the answer to that.
Yeah, no, and it just all goes back to that bookkeeping and being really transparent, because they want to see where that money goes. When an individual is like operating, whether it be like for nonprofit or profit within like a space for an event.
Yeah.
So like there would have to be like some sort of like writing that's accessible either on like an online platform, social media, or website that does explicitly state, even though like we're doing it like in here, like there's pretty much like no money going around, or if it is, like we'll tell you where it goes.
Awesome. Bobby, thank you very, very much for joining me. I really appreciate your time. I know everyone here really appreciates you joining me as well. Your insight is second to none. I really appreciate you joining us. Go kill it. You're going to do awesome. Thank you very much, Bobby.
Really great host, and yeah.
Have fun, right?
Yeah, you have fun. Thank you very much.
Alright, so while Bobby's still here, if he wants to yell something out while I'm going through, he can be like, that stinks! Or that's actually a good policy. I'll try to see if we can get some stuff in, so this way he can do that if he wants to while he's on his way out. So how does this compare to other guidelines? We're going to review Nintendo's guidelines to Electronic Arts, to Epic's Fortnite, as well as Capcom's America's Community License as well. We're going to pick up the pace a little bit, because I know we're a little behind schedule. So here we are. Electronic Arts Community Tournament Guidelines. What are some things that are the take-homes for EA? They have no limitation on who or what may organize tournaments. Nintendo requires that you be an individual. Again, if you are a company, you have to obtain a license, period, end of discussion. EA doesn't care. You could be an individual, you could be a company. They have no limitation on who or may organize the tournaments. They have no disclosed limit regarding to the number of participants. Nintendo has 200 in person, 300 in line. EA does not care. There is a participation fee of no greater than $20 per person. That is mimicked by Nintendo. They nailed that exactly. I'm not saying they take it from EA, but that seems to be somewhat of the standard, and that's what they've gone with. Prize pools must not exceed $10,000 within a 12-month period. Sound familiar? That's what Nintendo put out as well. You may have some sponsors, so long as they fit within EA guidelines, meaning there could be no sponsors doing alcohol, tobacco, gambling, crypto, political messages, pornography, firearms, etc. But EA allows you to have sponsors, that blew my mind. I always thought of EA, no offense to EA, but I always thought of EA as maybe being a little bit more restrictive, or that they might be, and maybe it was misplaced, thought on my part, because Nintendo wants to protect their IP without a doubt, but I always view EA as maybe not having the same sway as Nintendo. And maybe perhaps because of Nintendo's sway, they can tell you, no sponsors, I don't care, take it or leave it. And maybe EA has to kind of go, all right, we understand. We've got FIFA, we've got some brands that might sponsor or might have some benefit from having sponsorships that go along with it that can fall in line with our views and aren't going to be so far aghast from what you see in the NBA or the NFL or in FIFA, and thus we will allow for you to be able to have some form of sponsorships that fall in line. But they also note here that you are unable to utilize EA logos, branding, etc. with your tournament, and you must disclose that the tournament is not affiliated with or sponsored by EA or its licensors. That is matched in Nintendo, right? You can't use any of their logos, you can't use any of their branding. Actually, I don't think they included that in the Nintendo part of it, but they do note that you can't utilize Nintendo's branding or anything with it. You can have that, that it's consisting of local tournament here with Super Smash Bros. You can include that it's, with something, but it cannot have like a Nintendo logo that's going along with your branding. We'll cover that quickly with Capcom. Capcom will actually allow you to take, let's say, a Street Fighter V logo, as long as you don't change it, either in its quality, its color, its effect, you keep it as the way it's intended by Capcom. You can actually have local tournament, Street Fighter V, and you can market it like that. You can put that out there, you can put it out for the world to see, and Capcom doesn't care. They give you permission to do so. Nintendo does not want you utilizing Nintendo or even really Nintendo adjacent related, anything that would hint towards IP. So they would allow for you to have a mention of the game or tournament that is the game that is the subject of the tournament, as long as it's not any of the direct IP itself. We have a question?
It was kind of going that direction. So what this means is like if you're doing a Madden tournament, you can't put the Madden box art on the poster.
Correct. What you can do though is you can put in there local tournament Madden 24. As long as you're not putting in the actual logo or artwork. That would be the answer to that. And what I thought was super funny with EA is that no sponsors that include high fat, salt, or sugar foods and drinks, or energy drinks. And therefore, I proposed the question of, then who will sponsor my stream? If not some form, if you go to every stream, if you go to every tournament, what's one of the one things that you see? Energy drinks, or sugary drinks. I don't even want to get into a discussion regarding whether it's good or bad for you. That's not what we're here to discuss. But you look at any market for streaming, whether it's on Twitch, or if you're on YouTube, or if you're on Facebook, right? No matter where you are, where are the most prominent advertisers within those communities? It is food and beverage.
And Raid Shadow Legends.
Right, and Raid Shadow Legends. Correct. So to be able to say that they don't want any high-fat, salt, or sugary food and drinks, or energy drinks, I find that just to be interesting because, again, who else then is going to sponsor, said local event, right? If not Ghost, then who, right? There's going to be somebody that will sponsor. So obviously we're not going to do an open panel discussion for this part of it, but I'll open it up to any questions if there are any regarding what we just talked about with EA. If not, we'll move on to Epic and their Fortnite's event license. Alright, so we'll move on to Epic's Fortnite event license terms. They note here, it is online only. You cannot hold in-person tournaments. Period. End of discussion. Everything for Fortnite needs to be online. There is no participant or spectator fees allowed. You cannot subsidize any of your tournament that you're putting together at all. It needs to come from you in particular. Total compensation to all participants may not exceed $25,000. So if you're feeling generous enough to cover the entire expense of your community tournament and also hand out money, they're willing to let you at least give $25,000 to the participants with it. Okay? You can have some sponsors with some limitations though, and that's where you can offset some of your expenses, if you will, so they're not horrible with it, but the idea that a local tournament that's not going to have the eyesight of a sponsor, that they can't collect fees in order to help with maybe a venue rent, right? That's rough. Although noted, it is only online, so it's not like that they're going to be able to do it in person anyway. But you could make the argument that it could be in person, but everyone playing online. That doesn't make any sense, right? But you could make the argument to say that if everyone's participating online through their servers, you could still try to make an argument to say that it's not an in-person tournament. They're not going through any particular server. It's all online. It just doesn't. Epic makes no sense, unfortunately. But if you were a smaller tournament, if you were to say, I'm going to get all of our friends together, maybe we're going to advertise it, we've got people from all over the United States, all around the world, we're all going to log in, we're all going to have this tournament, and now you're in a position where you need to maybe rent or advertise, maybe you have some form of server space, or maybe you have some form of, place that you need to have for your back end to ensure that your event goes smoothly. Hosting, right? Because the participants can be, online, but maybe perhaps the equipment that you need to rent, or maybe the venue where the hosts need to be. All of this stuff might need to be actually in person at a location of which you don't have the ability to have. Well, again, you can only offset that with sponsorships if you go through Epic and you go through Fortnite's event license terms. And I find that to be very interesting because they completely cut off smaller events on that front. They also say that you cannot receive more than $25,000 per event from sponsors. You may utilize Epic or Fortnite branding in only your tournament logo. So you are able to utilize Epic or Fortnite logos, but it can only be in your tournament logo. That's it. So that is at least a little bit better than what you encountered with Nintendo and with EA. You also state that, or they also state that, you must disclose that this event is not sponsored, endorsed, or administered by Epic Games Incorporated. So what does this mean as a whole in comparison to Nintendo and to EA? Again, online only, you can't collect fees, you're completely cut off to only sponsors whatsoever, which, again, in my opinion, cuts off all smaller tournaments altogether. They do allow you to be able to give more money to the participants, and you cannot receive more than $25,000 from sponsors, so if you are able to get sponsors, at least they could be the ones to present the prizes to you, but they do give you some leeway that Nintendo and EA doesn't, which is you can use their branding in their logo or in your logo. And then finally, the standard that you're going to see is that you have to just state that Epic Games or insert company here is not affiliated or sponsoring your event. So that's the breakdown for Epic and Fortnite. Oh wait, and then there's this. Okay, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to give you a synopsis of it. By utilizing Epic or Fortnite or any form of Epic entity, you are agreeing to limit damages that you sustain from Epic to $250, and multiple claims does not expand this limitation. So what that means is that if Epic were to do something that hurt your tournament, and let's say they were to purposefully do something that hurt your tournament by just using Fortnite or using an Epic-related IP in your tournament, you are agreeing that in return for being able to utilize this, if you hurt me and give me damages, I can only receive $250 from you, Epic. That is not reflected in my review of similar licensures with any other of the major companies. I was absolutely floored by this. When I brought it up and showed Bobbeigh as well, Bobbeigh was floored by this as well. It's kind of snuck in towards the back end of it as well. And I just had such a good laugh that essentially they're like, look, and in the end, at the end of the day, if we end up making some form of a problem or mistake and it causes you damage, just by utilizing Fortnite, you could only get $250 for it. That's it.
So is this just Fortnite? Because Rocket League is also Epic, and that's their big esport game. Is this also apply to Rocket League, or is this literally just for Fortnite?
So this is Epic and Epic Party. So meaning that I would, in my...
But these guys keep calling it the Fortnite guidelines, but is this for all Epic properties?
This is Epic properties, correct.
Okay, so Rocket League is the big one that they're...
Correct. It was a poor wording on the title for Fortnite on that part, but it is essentially Epic's IP, and this falls under exactly what you're saying. It could be Rocket League, it could be Fortnite, anything that's under Epic, you are limited to $250, and the funny part is that multiple claims just doesn't expand it. That's it. It's just $250. That's it. Do you have any questions regarding Epic before we move on to the final one, which is Capcom? Alright, we're going to move on to Capcom. We're going to get you going. Capcom America's community license, I think, my opinion, spoiler alert, is the standard within the community. Okay? It's restrictive to where Capcom can reserve their rights and still feel like they're protected, but it is not prohibitive. Okay? They know that a prize pool must not exceed $10,000 per event. There is no limitation per 12-month period. If you want to hold multiple events, you're more than welcome to do so. You're just limited to $10,000 per event. Sponsorship contributions must not exceed $6,000 per event, and it cannot exceed $30,000 within a 12-month period. And what they're trying to do is to cut off sponsors from taking, or smaller events from taking a hold over the competitive Street Fighter scene, and really from preventing Capcom from keeping a chokehold on that, unintended. So, you cannot exceed $6,000 per event in sponsorship, and you cannot exceed $30,000 within a 12-month period, but they don't limit you. If you want to keep going afterwards, you're welcome to. It's going to be out of your own pocket. They have no disclosed limits on the number of participants per event. In person, online, doesn't matter. You go ahead, you bring as many as you want, you can do so. They give no guidance on the collection of participation fees. You want to charge $100, charge $100. You want to charge $20, charge $20. Whatever you're looking for, go for it. There's no guidance on it. Capcom allows for the collection of spectator fees with no set requirements either. Go for it. You want to collect a fee, go for it. Doesn't matter how much it's going to be. You want to sell VIP seats, go sell VIP seats. Do it. You're welcome to do it. But, as we noted with everybody else, you must disclose that this event is not affiliated with or sponsored by Capcom. They do have limitation on your sponsors, though, but I think that this is worded a bit nicer or a little bit more approachable than the others. And essentially just says there that your event cannot be sponsored by companies that sell or promote, and your event cannot be involved with any products or services that are inconsistent with the applicable A rating of the game. So if you do an E rating, you can't be having anything that's of a teen or adult theme. Capcom could step in to say that that's inappropriate. If you get a teen rated game, you can't have anything that's explicit, okay, or horribly inappropriate. It also cannot be associated with or relate to gambling, betting, wagering, or lottery. Understandable, that's fine. Cannot have inappropriate or offensive, including the following categories: pornography, tobacco, vaping, including e-cigarettes, firearms, drugs, alcohol, beverages, political advertising, and gambling. All of it completely reasonable in a relatively easily digestible, paragraph, which is a bit easier to approach than what the other companies were doing as well. And they leave some room for reasonable sponsorships. They give guidance on the use of logos and branding. Now, I know you can't really see what's on here. It's a little bit on the smaller side, but I'll try to make sure that I relay it over to you. You can use your logo and your event with the Capcom-related advertising as well. You just can't mix the two. Look at it in that particular way. You can't put your logo over the Street Fighter V Championship Edition logo, okay? You can't have it to where they share, the exact same background with no separation, and you modify the Street Fighter logo itself, right? That would be the second example of what you've got there. What you can do is have a clear distinction between what your brand event is and using the provided material from Capcom for Street Fighter V. So they give you very clear guidance to say they need to be separate, but you can mix the two as long as you keep the integrity of the IP or the marketing, I guess you could say, picture that we provide to you, or media that we provide to you. They also give further guidance on what you can and cannot do with their logos. So for example, you can't morph it. So if it's a straight-facing logo, you can't then put it on, skew to a right or left-hand side. You need to keep it exactly as it's intended, right? You can't move elements. So in other words, you can't now take, Street Fighter and lower it down on the, Roman numeral for 5, right? You can't make that change. And you also can't change the effects. So if there is a glow, or if you're looking at, text size, or if you're looking at anything that revolves around, an effect on the logo, you can't change any of those effects as well. You have to keep the integrity of what is provided through Capcom's, we'll call it media, that they provide to you. Okay, you can't compress the images as well. You have to maintain the integrity, the image quality of it. You can't change the colors either. You need to, again, maintain the integrity of it. You can't change the font type. But as long as you follow that, doubling back to what we have, Capcom will allow you to utilize their branding in your own marketing materials. And that is not seen anywhere else, really, truly, with the major players. So, with that being said, do we have any questions regarding Capcom before we go to a summary and then wrap things up so everyone can continue joining AGDQ?
I have a question kind of good that came in with just like defining what a sponsor is and how that is, and it applies to all of them.
Yeah.
But, okay, so let's say there's a game place or something and they have an event space. And you can normally rent that event space out for like, let's say $1,000. Let's just make it, for like parties, birthday parties or whatever. But you're an individual, you want to do a tournament, and the person says, I will give you that space for free to run the tournament at my store. Is that technically a sponsorship if they are giving, and is that now $1,000 off of what you can get from other sponsors? Or does Nintendo not even allow that and say, no, you have to pay for the space?
That's a great question. I'm just going to relay it to make sure that it's heard on the recording, which is that, let's say you're holding a tournament, you're going to somebody, they're going to rent you the space, it's $1,000, arbitrary figure, and that person then says, you know what, I'm actually going to comp it. I'm going to let you go ahead and just run your event here, and all you have to do is just, be here, because they know that it's going to bring business to them, and therefore it's an expense for them that they can also say it benefits me, okay? Is that going to be considered a sponsorship? My argument, there is no hard or fast guidance on this, but my argument would be yes. You are receiving goods or services, you're receiving some form of monetary compensation, some form of value, and it is going towards your event. The question is any of that going to be reported? Right? I'm not advocating for that not to be reported. It should be reported. If you are watching this and you're in this situation, please report anything that comes in like that. But on the off chance that something like that is just maybe the day of the event, the owner goes, wow, this, you know what, I think this is going to be really good for me. You know what, don't worry about it. I'm not going to charge you for it. Technically, is that now a donation from the company if there was an agreed upon, or an agreement between the parties regarding the rental use of it? And now that's changed. Well, technically, they just gave you a donation of $1,000. If nothing was ever in writing and the parties just agree, you know what, we don't want to actually charge you for it, you can just go ahead and do that. You can make an argument and say that there's not really any value exchange. But in your scenario of agreed upon $1,000 for the event or whatever the amount is, and then that no longer exists, well, an agreement between the parties was utilized. You were going to pay for it otherwise, and then they now, out of the goodness of their heart, business, for their own benefit, are now saying, let's wait.
And so that would have run afoul of Nintendo's guidelines because now you have a sponsor.
Correct. That's my opinion or my take on it. I would argue it in that fashion. Now, do I think that we would ever get to a point to where that would be a problem? Yeah. A small tournament, if someone decides to say I'm going to leave it because it's good for my business, is Nintendo ever going to get whiff of that? Absolutely not. It's not going to happen.
But if you take money in, you have to report all that stuff.
Correct.
And that may come up.
Correct.
If they are transparent. So they would get wind of it because they would, if they look at that.
Correct. If money exchanges hands, though, that's the key thing.
But this is a good or service, not money.
So the question is going to end up being, is it a good or service or money, right? And you could argue to say that the venue space they're providing, let's say, actually that's a good question. I would say they're providing a service to you. They're allowing you to be able to utilize their infrastructure, to be able to host your event. It's a donation of services. If, like I said, all of it is out of the scope of any form of contractual obligation, and it's a verbal contract between, let's say, the space owner and the organizer, and there's no contractual, obligation between the parties other than a verbal, and there's no written version of an agreement between the parties, I would argue and say that if no money's ever exchanged hands, and no contract was ever signed by the parties, then maybe a verbal modification of the contract occurred, of which the parties agreed, right? We don't even need to say that. We could just say the parties agreed to, negate the contract altogether, and that they came to an agreement outside of it, which was just to utilize the space for free. And then there's no real reporting on that needs to be done.
Okay.
The only time that I'd be worried about that is if there was an exchange of funds that we talked about. If I give the 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever it is to the event, to the space owner, and then at that point they say, you know what, I'm going to make it a donation, or I'm going to make it towards your, your prizes or whatever, that's now a sponsorship in my eyes. And then you would have to argue that as such. But if no money's ever exchanged hands, there's no true written agreement between the parties, you can make an argument that the agreement is null and void, and that they have just come to their own understanding outside of it. At least that's what I would argue. Any other questions before we get to the summary? We have one more.
Do any of the other companies besides Nintendo explicitly prohibit using modified versions of games?
To my understanding of the ones that I reviewed, the answer is no. Now, there are most likely going to be other companies that absolutely have that type of stance. I don't know them off the top of my head, so you'll have to accept my apologies on that. If memory serves me correct, EA is silent on it. They have no knowledge regarding any form of modded EA content or games, or IP. I believe Capcom does not know anything as well. We have noted or seen in tournaments people wearing or having their characters wear costumes that aren't originally in the game. I'm not going to touch the one that people might be thinking of that caused a lot of controversy and stir not that long ago. But you are still allowed to be able to have, a change on Ken's costume, right? Or maybe have like a different color for Ken that might not be there, or Blanca, or whoever, right? You are still allowed to be able to have that. And I don't think that's explicitly laid out. I might be wrong, but I'm going based off of memory at the moment. I don't believe that there is a change on that regarding any form of modified version for Capcom as well.
So there isn't now, legally there isn't yet, but in the past couple of weeks, Capcom has taken an aggressive stance against mods.
Okay.
And so the legal agreement may change very soon.
Understood. So we have a great point in the audience, which is that Capcom recently has taken a more aggressive stance regarding modification, and that might actually end up changing. From what I'm reading from, just for the record, is from Capcom Street Fighter V guidance and their community tournament guidelines. They do not have community tournament guidelines for Street Fighter VI yet. So with that in mind, maybe as they're drafting up the new community tournament guidelines for Street Fighter VI, at that point, maybe we might see that language in there. But if you're utilizing Street Fighter V for your tournament, then these guidelines, I don't believe, have any form of restrictions regarding any form of modification to the game. Do you have another question?
When new restrictions and guidelines are out, are they retroactive or are they specific, like in Capcom's instance, to that one game?
So the question is that are guidances that are released retroactive? And the answer is no. They should not be retroactive. We look at it just like any type of law, or we should look at it just like any type of law, which is, or even, I'm only going to use it as a reference for law. We look at it just like any other contract, is the way you should reference it. If there is now a law that says that X is illegal, and I did X 10 years ago, I can't now be responsible or held to a legal standard that didn't exist 10 years ago.
I meant for titles. Retroactive for titles.
Retroactive for titles in terms of...
So if I'm running a Street Fighter V competition,
yeah.
will the now Street Fighter 6 apply to that? If I'm holding it in the future?
Okay, you mean based on games?
On the games.
Okay, so I would still argue that still with the same line of thought that I have here, which is that retroactive, you can't enforce or do anything that's already happened, per se, right? That's already happened. You can't have a tournament that fell within your guidelines and then now go to them and say you're banned because you did something that we now disagree with. I think that, could they technically do that? Yes. Are they going to do that? No. Right? But if you were in a situation to where they were to make a change or a modification to Street Fighter 6, and it's not, because you're referencing individual titles, and it's not referenced to Street Fighter 5, could you make an argument that what happens in Street Fighter 6 should be applied to Street Fighter 5? You could make that argument. But these are individual contracts, which brings me back to maybe the law part of it isn't a great, analogy, but maybe the contractual comparison is better, which is that these are essentially use contracts. You're agreeing that the company is giving you permission to utilize their IP asset in certain situations, and in return for being able to utilize their IP without them cutting you off completely, you agree to do X, right? And if they were to say in Street Fighter 6, you're limited to this, you could say, okay, well, but that's Street Fighter 6. What about your guidance on Street Fighter 5? So if Capcom were to put something into 6 but not into 5, you could make a reasonable argument, unless it's an overarching item, like for Epic, it's Epic titles altogether. For EA, it's EA titles altogether. For Nintendo, Nintendo titles altogether. If you're looking at individual game titles, you would refer to or should refer to the contract of which you agreed to in its usage to find out for better guidance. That would be the way that I would summarize that. Do you have any other questions before we head over to the summary? Alright, so summary. Community tournament guidelines help intellectual property holders to protect their assets and control how third parties utilize their IP, thus limiting liability and maintaining their brand image. Nintendo's community tournament guidelines are restrictive but not prohibitive. The key takeaway, I think, is what we talked about with Bobbeigh, which is that it's the crackdown on the modding community, it's the crackdown on specifically things like randomizers, archipelago. These are the things that are going to be most harmed by the Nintendo guidelines or the community tournament guidelines because it's trying to squash that. You can even make an argument that they could try to say that it should only be Nintendo branded equipment at said tournaments as well. But we don't really need to get into that level of detail. These guidelines will have no effect on players or participants. So you here in attendance, unless you're putting together these tournaments and you're intending to be able to hopefully profit from it, right? This isn't going to affect you. If you're a participant in the game, or in the tournaments, or you're a spectator, it doesn't hurt you in any way, shape, or form. Okay? Play on, keep going. Nintendo's not taking that away from you. My opinion, however, is that these guidelines are intended to squash individuals or companies, because obviously they need to just get a license, they can't just do it, from profiting from small-scale amateur esports tournaments outside of the watchful eye of Nintendo. That is truly what I think the guidelines are intended to do. Again, so I can word it a little bit better without fumbling over it, is that they want to stop individuals and companies from profiting from small-scale amateur esport tournaments outside of Nintendo's watchful eye. Okay? And as with most companies, exceptions may be granted if you're applying for a license. So that's one thing that people forget. With any of these companies, you can apply for a license and ask for an exemption. You could say, I want to charge $50 per event for each participant. I want to charge $30 per spectator. I want to do this, I want to do that. What's the worst that they can say? No, they don't grant you the license? But to this point, you could always try to go for an exception. The worst thing is that they could just say no. So that being said, I'll open it up one last time for audience Q&A. If you have any questions. Hopefully that was sufficient enough and it answered any questions that you did have or any curiosities you had regarding the Nintendo Community Guidelines. Thank you very, very much for attending, and I hope you have a great time at the remainder of AGDQ 2024.